All right, well, where do we want to go next?
Did I get that before anybody else?
Yeah, that was pretty quick.
Some idea I'm kind of obsessed with is the difference between my self-interest or perspective as a individuated unit versus OM and their perspective. And I'm wondering, is OM actually more concerned about novelty and new data than quality of consciousness?
No, I would think, I wouldn't say more interested than in quality of consciousness. Quality of consciousness is the path of evolution. So the larger conscious system, or OM, is evolving. It's an evolving system. And one of the things that helps that system evolve is novelty in experience. You know, that's why the randomness is good. It helps generate the rich choices that we have that enable us to evolve. So I would say that the larger conscious system is focused on its evolution, and that's the primary thing. And the novelty of experience is one of the tools that you can use to do that. Because without that, then it's just sameness, right? If you have no novelty of experience, then you basically have a monolithic sameness and nothing happens. You can't evolve out of that because there's no choices. Evolution requires choice. And it requires free will choice. Otherwise, nothing can evolve. It's just following a script if it's not making free choices. So for evolution to take place, you need free will and you need choices. And the novel information helps create those opportunities. That's partly why would make the decision to split itself up into pieces that interact with each other, because in so much as you have all those interactions, you have a whole lot higher, a whole lot richer choices to make than if you just have one monolithic thing searching for novelty. You see, that's a slow grower. That's a slow evolver, if you will. Now when you have a whole bunch of things that are all interacting, well, they're creating novelty for each other. Because of the interaction, you get 100 things together, and the way they interact and how they drive things. One thing affects all the other things, and you get the action and interaction and feedback, and suddenly you have a really complex thing, and that complex thing then creates a lot of choice, a lot of opportunity for growth. That's basically why the system, that's my logic for why the system would break into pieces and have those pieces interact with each other, as opposed to just stay a monolithic consciousness. So as a monolithic consciousness, evolution is tough. So you do this, you break it into the pieces and let them interact, because that introduces all sorts of unknowns and possibilities that didn't exist before. Suddenly you have a very rich soup from which you can evolve. So we're part of that strategy of evolution of the larger thing.
Is a Hitler, for example, is not Hitler an example of extremely valuable data, as opposed to an extraordinary failure?
Well, yeah, probably. Probably so, in the sense all the data is valuable, but it's valuable to know what goes wrong as well as what goes right. And that, a Hitler does a lot of things, and all of them aren't bad. The ones that you think of are bad, murdering and killing and, the supremo fascist right of our time and so on. But besides that, there were, during all the chaos that was created by Hitler, also created a lot of opportunity for heroism, for doing kind deeds, for helping each other, for, you can think a lot of that was spurred at the same time, because people now suddenly had to deal with very difficult circumstances and make a lot of difficult choices. And some of those difficult choices were made very well, and people grew from them. So it's not just a matter of the death and destruction, but there was a lot of opportunity there. You have a Viktor Frankl, coming out and having a whole different viewpoint of reality and writing about it. It came out of that same sort of thing. So even in the most kind of depraved and evil that creates opportunity too.
Now, we want to deal with Hitler's feedback, but I'm saying from the point of view of Elm.
Yeah, so from the bigger reality, there's things to be learned in almost everything. There's very little that you could just point out and say, well, that was a disaster. Typically, the disaster also has, you know, silver linings in it. But he also gave us a wonderful bad example of what not to become. You know, as we think about government, we think about fascism, we think about militarism and the rest of it, we can kind of look back and think of Adolf and think, well, there's a good way not to go. You know, we need to be careful we don't make those mistakes again. So it serves a purpose as
He
well.
was just one man, and if he hadn't had a lot of other consciousness making bad decisions backing him up, he would have just been one crazy man. He would have had no power.
That's exactly right.
And everybody says Hitler, like Hitler controlled everything and caused everything, but Hitler in agreement with a lot of other consciousness.
Right. Hitler was just an enabler.
Yeah.
You know, all of our leaders and all of our, you know, people who wield power are there because we allow them to be there.
So I'm trying to figure out how can I use this information to game the system, right? So, so I've got the love thing covered, I think. I mean, theoretically, you know, work on that. But if we really want to sort of kiss old ass and, you know, get on the good side and work the system, do we? Is it? And if novelty is highly valued, should we not be overcoming fear to generate novelty and novel data?
I think you should be overcoming fear in order to lower your entropy and raise the quality of your consciousness. And you'll find that novelty is something that you don't have to generate. It's all around you. You know, novelty basically is good because it creates opportunity. New opportunities are created, you know, from new situations. New things go together in different ways. Suddenly there's opportunity that you didn't have before. So novelty is a great generator of opportunity. That's why we have so much randomness in the system, because randomness creates opportunity, novelty. So novelty is just a tool, but the point is to, you know, grow the quality of your consciousness. That's that love thing that you think you got. That's really what it is all about. That's the core thing. And that you have novelty, that's a tool that helps you get there, but it's not an endpoint. You're not going to get extra points for, you know, producing novelty. You get extra points for taking whatever novelty you find and turning it into growth at the being level. That's where your points. There isn't any way to game the system. The only way to game the system is to play it the way it's, you know, the way it is, and is to basically lower your personal entropy and grow toward love and that sort of thing. That's the point of the system. And if you do that, then you're getting ahead as quickly as you can. And the way to game it, I guess, if you will, I wouldn't really call it gaming it, but the way to make it more efficient process would be, one, to understand what the process is. You know, you're here, right? So you kind of have a bigger picture that there is a process, and maybe what it is. And secondly, is to increase your awareness of that process. And you do that just by expanding your own decision space. You know, that's all, you know, we talk about, you know, out of body and that kind of stuff. All that is just expanding your decision space. You were limited to this much decision space, and now your reality is that much bigger. You get that much decision space. The bigger your decision space gets, the more it all gets integrated. The less you feel like it's, you know, free will awareness unit, you know, integrated or individuated unit of consciousness, our own guides, you know, have everything broken up into pieces, and the more awareness you get, the more that all just glums together. And it you no longer need all those metaphors for separating things to talk about it. It's just reality. It's the way it is. And once you understand that, I think it's easier then to grow, because you start feeling a part of this bigger thing rather than a separate thing trying to game the system, trying to figure out, you know, what to do next. You just feel integrated with this part, and then everything comes natural after that. You know, somebody once asked me a long time ago, says, what's the best way, what do I have to know, what's the best way to learn to raise my children? You know, raising a child is a very daunting task, right? It takes a lot of creativity and thought. And the question was, you know, what do I have to learn? What should I study? What books should I read? You know, what do I have to do to be a good parent, raise a child? And the answer to that was, get your own head straight and just act naturally. You know, that's the best way to raise a child. You know, it's your problems and your ego and your efforts is what's going to give your child a problem. You know, so if you can get rid of all of that, if you can grow up, then what to do in all of those situations, it just comes naturally. It's just there. Just do it the way you feel like it. Do it the way it comes, and it'll be right. When you do it the way it comes and it's wrong, it's because of your ego. It's because of your fear. It's because of all these other things is what creates the wrong, the wrong approach. So it's the same in growing up. You know, you get your own head straight, which basically means you get rid of the fear and you get rid of the ego, and after that, things just start to fall together. You see bigger pictures, your reality grows, you're just part of the whole. Like I say, you don't try to control everything, and it all just works out really nice. Then you get some synergy and you grow faster. So that's kind of if you're looking for a fast track, that would be more of the fast track, is to let your awareness grow up, and not at the intellectual level. Again, it's got to be at the being level. An intellectual level is not going to get you very far. Actually, it gets a lot of people frustrated because they want to go out of body. You know, they want to get in this bigger reality, but they're doing it all through their intellect, and it doesn't work. And they're sitting there trying to do it, and it doesn't work. And they get frustrated with it. Well, all that's ego, you know, and they're going backwards. Best thing to do is not to, it's like pushing on a rope. You know, you need to not do that. You need to let that go, get your head straight, and just act natural.
I have a question about the idea that dreams and OBEs and lucid dreams are test situations. I'm curious as to how the planning process for these tailor-made tests takes place. And
Okay.
who is involved? How does it occur?
They're not test situations for everybody. Typically, it depends whether you're at a point in your development where that kind of intervention or help is going to be useful to you. If it's not useful to you, then your dreams are just dreams. They're almost like, it's not random. They're still educational, but they don't seem to have any particular theme to them. They're not particularly coordinated, or they're working at a particular point. And some of it just seems to be a rehash. But so it's kind of like you're in daycare. See, daycare doesn't have a real obvious curriculum. The curriculum is everybody have fun, play with the toys, and don't hit other children, and it's not a very strongly organized or structured curriculum. It's very light.
So when there is a situation where there's a structured
So when you get to the point where a structured approach becomes good for you, becomes something you can deal with and profit from, then it tends to get more structured. So it's like now you're in third grade, and now you have spelling, and you have reading, and you have writing, you have all these things that starts to get a lot more structured. That is when you will start getting these dreams, and you'll see that there's consistency to them. There's a point. What you're working on is an ego response to something or other. And you'll be in this dream, and suddenly it's like you're put in a situation. It's almost like there's this little vignette, this little skit that's going on. And suddenly there you are, and there's a predicament. There you are, and here's the starving children, and here's this and that. And what do you do?
Right.
And then you have to interact with it. And you'll get, if you don't do it right, if you act with fear or with ego, then you'll get another one. And it'll be similar in its type, but just different. Because they don't keep giving you the same one over and over, although sometimes you can get the same one in a row, but you get a different one. And then you'll get a different one. And then one day when you get it and you react right at the being level, they're gone, just like that. It disappears, and then you go on to something else. This is now where you're getting kind of a curriculum designed for you, because you're at a point where you can learn from it. And you can think of them as tests, or you can just think of them as lessons, opportunities. They're opportunities to learn, and they're often things that you would not experience here. Things more that would be very difficult or very, very interrupting, in your life to do here. But you can in the dream world, because there's no residuals. You don't have to take any of it home, right? It's there. So they will happen. Okay, who's doing that? Again, let's just say the larger consciousness system. If we want to make that so it's not quite so abstract, we'll say guides. But guides are just the larger consciousness system. And the system sees that you could gain from that you're trying, that you have an intent to grow and to learn and that sort of thing, and they start working with you. And that's different from somebody who is in kindergarten and, you know, they don't necessarily work with people who aren't ready. So the system does it, and it's for your benefit.
Can I ask you, within these situations, how does one discern between self-aware, free-willed, non-physical matter reality resident and something that's just part of the test situation that seems to be a zombie or thought form or something like this?
Well, it's the way they interact with you. You see that when they're interacting with you, presents you with a set of choices. You know, because that's typically the way it is. You're just thrown in a thing where you have certain choices to make. And if it's consistent and thoughtful, and you know that you're being worked with,
It's safe to assume that there's something.
there's something behind that. But you still have free will to make any choice you want. You still have to capture that opportunity and do something with it. It's not putting you in a box where you don't have choices. But now, how do you distinguish that from the rest? You don't really, other than by the interaction and the type. It's all just data. You don't really know where the data comes from. You just deal with the data that you get.
Yeah.
But see, it's like that here too.
Yeah.
You basically deal with the data you get.
Yeah.
Although in this
Well,
physical
it's
reality,
the
it comes
source
from
of anything, just the,
yeah. So the source is kind of irrelevant. It's just data. So sources, you know, are different.
So I'm wondering along the same lines, when one finds themselves plopped into a situation, is there any possibility that, since in My Big TOE it said that we have parallel selves operating in other physical matter realities relative to their perspective, is there any chance that these could be memories or fragments of other free will awareness units, bleeding information?
There is
Possibly through
a
the
possibility of
control.
that, but it's not likely unless you're thinking of it. In other words, your intent really limits the data you get. So if you're thinking about that and wondering about that, you may get some of that. Otherwise, if you're not, then you probably won't, and there's not that many of us that are doing that many things at once. That's not typical. Typically, we have one thing going at a time, and that's because learning is generally a serial process. You know, it wouldn't do any good if you took an 8-year-old and gave him all of what 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade all at the same time. They can't deal with it. They can only deal with this much more than where they are, and then after that, they can only deal with this much more. So it tends to be a serial process. You take steps. So parallel processing is not that effective as far as evolution goes. It's more of a cumulative process.
Would someone in physical matter reality expresses the disease or condition as known as multiple personality disorder? Would this have anything to do with some glitch or malfunctioning?
Could do. It could have.
Processing,
Could have several reasons. You could have you might be, your physiology might be defective. Again, there's some randomness in that. As that ovum and sperm match and the DNA gets mixed and spread up, and all how that goes on. That's a very delicate process, and there's some uncertainty in it. That's why we all come out different, and there's a big spectrum of, there's a big curve like this, and mostly in here it's normal, and outside of there it gets less normal, and those tails of the curves go way out, because there is a lot of randomness in the process that can create different things. You may just have defective brain chemistry. Well, that's like being born with one leg. It limits what you can do. It limits what you can do with that body. It may be, so that may be one of the hallucinations. It could be that that defective brain chemistry actually is opening the door to a larger reality frame, and you are getting bits and pieces of it, but you don't know how to interpret it. And particularly if you find that fearful, and you find that other people look at you like you're nuts, then you try to control it or get it away, but you can't get it away because it's just the way you are. And if that becomes a problem for you, then it can actually drive you nuts, right? Well, at least it drives you to a point where other people label you as nuts. So that's it could be that. It could be that you are just being meddled with. There could be other entities that are pushing that information at you outside. I mean, there's all number of things that it could be. Or it might just be a default, a defective brain.
Well, yeah. I was curious about that because I've read that those patients actually have different sets of vital signs associated with the different personalities, different blood pressures, EEGs.
Could very well be that way. But that doesn't mean that somebody else is jumping into their body. What it means is that they're kind of linking, if you will. I know this is like New Agey talk. They're kind of linking to the vibe of this other person, which means they're communicating. They're exchanging data to the point that they kind of resonate. There's empathy. You can do that. They've also done that with people in separate rooms where there's empathy between them, right? And then they'll scare one or give them an ugly picture or something. They can measure the change on the other person. There's this connection. Well, if you happen to be close or be open to that kind of communication and don't know how to turn it off, then it can affect you. And yeah, I would suspect that body signs and other things might change to suit. But we tend to jump into possession and somebody else is taking over the body and so on, and it doesn't have to be anything dramatic like that. That's more Hollywood than anything else.
Could it also be a neurological reaction to, like a physiological reaction to them perceiving the either blended stream of data or the different stream of data without understanding what it is, which I think
labeling them with personalities.
Schizophrenia or something like that, I think can be sometimes explained by too much access, maybe two streams of data, and not knowing that, and having maybe randomly, accidentally been proved right by some paranoid thought or something like that, and to make it very real, and then yes, they get labeled, but it's a matter of understanding that there is a parallel thing going on that isn't recognized, as I mean, it is recognized as mental illness.
Yeah. Well, you have to realize that what we define as mental illness often has nothing to do with illness in the nature of what an illness is.
Yeah.
We label mentally ill those people who are different than we are. You have this norm, and if you fit far enough outside the norm, the norm is sort of behavioral norm.
Yeah.
What you see and hear, and the way your reality is, your interpretation of your reality. If it's outside the norm, you're mentally ill. So basically, that's how we define that kind of illness. Now, you might have all sorts of voices that talk in your head and do everything else, but if you're okay with that, and you've dealt with it successfully so that it doesn't make you do things that make you look not normal, well, then you're not mentally ill.
Yeah.
So our mental illness is really a definition of how much you deviate from normal behavior.
Sure, or approved.
Yeah, approved.
Socially normal.
Well, normal is approved, because if most of the people do it, then it's approved.
Right.
If everybody was schizophrenic, then not being schizophrenic would be mental illness.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of thing.
So the way that the psychology is basically like a system like physics and any other, the brain has a rule set. Neuroscience, the neurotransmitters do certain things and have certain effects, and which we're just learning about. With novelty, when I came back in, you guys were discussing novelty, and that gets our attention. Novelty gets our attention. That's how it works in psychology, and that's what they figured out so far. That something they pulled out that seems to, I agree with strongly, I guess is how to put it. And I was thinking, so I was sitting here thinking, and realized that when you're young, pretty much everything's novel. And that's just they are attention. I mean, being aware, and they are aware, so much more aware. Young experiences here, when you're not all blinded by all the the belief that atoms are little dots running around the nucleus. And before that steps, those kind of beliefs step in, is that it's something that understanding in psychology and in the mental disorders and dis-eases is how to not so much change the way people process information, but a more understanding of how people process information, making a science or evolving science into something that is more useful to helping people or helping people. So, do you think that's why science, why like neuroscience and why it's so important to change the paradigm?
Oh, it's very important to change the paradigm. We have when you define illness as different from you, if you're not like me, then there's something wrong with you. It's basically the root of that
Yes.
kind of understanding. If you're not like me, there's something wrong with you. That's not a good perspective to take into the world. We could be a lot more helpful to those of us that are different. Sometimes the difference makes you dysfunctional. You can't dress yourself, you can't feed yourself, you can't hold a job. And we need to have a little more compassion in dealing with people who are different than we are. And if we go back in our history, they used to be locked up. If you were too different, your parents would lock you up in your bedroom, because you were an embarrassment to the family, sort of thing. We've come a ways from that, but we still have a long ways yet to go. Good.
I want to ask you something like Jeff asked, but from another perspective. Our IUOC awareness, how does it get affected by our awareness? I mean, I think from what you said before, it has the choice of following it or doing something else. So my question is, for example, if we're going through a bad day, the other part of our IUOC can have a choice of ignoring it or get affected by it somehow?
Yeah, well, it depends. Let's look at the video game. How do you, as a player of a video game, get affected by your characters? Do you learn anything? Is there any growing involved? You're playing this video game and your character's getting beaten up or whatever. Well, you learn a few things. You learn strategy to help, to work your character better. You may learn patience, because you may have to go through this maze 100 times before you figure out how to get through it. It may teach you patience. It may teach you memory, because you have to go through certain sequences. And so there's things that you as the player actually learn and grow as you're working with your character. But then there's other times, the things that your character's doing, that you don't really get much out of it. You just kind of ignore it, and there's not a lot in there for you to learn. It's just the way the game is. It's sort of like that's the way it's programmed, that's the way it happens. All right, the character jumps up and down, or does a little dance or something, but it doesn't mean that much to you. That's the character doing that kind of on their own. So it's kind of the same way. So you are an individuated unit of consciousness, so that's the big thing. And here you are in this reality, in a free will awareness unit. You are having experience, and as much as you can grow up, that helps your whole. That helps your IUOC. IUOC. That helps that grow up as well. So you're just a piece of a bigger thing. The bigger thing is always aware of you and would always like to help you out, but sometimes the bigger thing just lets you go on your own, because you're not really doing anything that it's going to, you just do what you do. You're interacting. Obviously there's not a hand up your back like you're a puppet, You're not being controlled. You have to have the free will to make your decisions. So it's, to a large extent, you're just loose here to do whatever it is you do. And the system will give you some help, and give you some nudges, and give you some ideas, and your intuition, you'll get thoughts. May, like this gentleman was saying, you may start getting lessons in your dreams and out of body, and all of this is there to help you. And your larger self is participant with that. So it's really, you have to see it all as one package, rather than separate things. It's all as one package, but there are times when you're getting nudged, there's times when you're just on your own.
Yeah, well, my question, for example, our IOC might be doing other tasks while we're here. Right now, might be doing other stuff.
Yeah, that happens,
So-
and that happens really with probably everybody, but most people are not aware of it.
Right, right.
As you get more aware of it, you actually become cognizant that there are other things going on. And you can even set that up as you can set that up like as an if-then trigger. And what I mean by that is, if somebody, let's say you're working with somebody, this happens to me sometimes, and they're really frightened. And you say, well, look, and if you're frightened, just call me. Call me to come help you, and I'll come help you. Or maybe they're doing out of body, just call my name out, and I'll be there to help you. Okay, now what I do is, in my mind then, I set up a conditional that says, if they call, go help. Now let's say it's the middle of the day for me, and I'm out, doing something else. I'm working math problems, or digging a ditch, or doing something, and this person's on the other side of the world, and they call for help. I personally am not aware of that, but there is another part of me that I've already set the intention, I've set the trigger, that if that happens, then you go do that, you see? Now, they will report to me later, oh, I called for you and thanks so much. I get all this kind of stuff. Well, I'm not digging a ditch, I'm doing something else. I wasn't involved in it at all. But you set up the condition, and you at a larger level can be doing all kinds of things, interacting, and it can be done on your own, set up on your own logic, if you will, so that happens. And that's kind of parallel processing. So there's part of you off doing other things that you might do yourself if you were aware of them, but you're not, so they get done anyway, because that part of you there's another part of you operating at another level than the part of you that's operating on this level. So here you are writing code, right? Because that's your job, and you're writing code, and you're really focused on that code. Well, you're not focused too much on other things. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some part of you busy at work doing something else some other place. You are more than just this, and all of it is really you. Now, most people have, one, no awareness of it at all, even that it exists, and two, if they have an awareness it exists, they don't realize that they can control it to the set that they can put up if-then statements or any other kind of statement that says, well, what I want you to do is keep an eye on such and such because their health is really bad and they need that work. And you set that up to do that like 24/7, keep working on that, and it'll happen. There'll be something there that'll be constantly doing that even though you're not paying attention to it. So yes, you can parallel process in that way, and what you're doing really, the way I see it, is like you're bifurcating. You're turning into more of you. It's like there's not only you, but there's several of you, and you can control all of them with your intent. You're just not aware of all of them at the same time.
Because, for example, we all come here and we learn about the big reality. We are also giving a message to ourselves to do related stuff to that, right? When we talk about these things and how we can help the system, other parts of ourselves also relate that and relate the intent to do stuff towards that, right?
Yes, as long as you have that intent. The intent isn't necessarily fulfilled by your local awareness.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're bigger than that. That you can get some action out of the rest of you as well, but you won't be aware of it. Now you might be aware of part of it. You see, now the more your awareness it gets, you might be aware of some of that, and you're aware that you can control it. And sometimes you might even be aware of what's going on in those other places. But that typically depends on how focused you are here. Now, if I'm just kind of in a hazy state, I'm sitting there at my computer, and maybe I'm not typing for a minute, I just kind of let my mind wander, I can be aware of several of me doing different things in different places. But if I'm sitting there composing and trying to get a good English sentence that says exactly what I want, no, I'm not aware of anything except, the computer and the keyboard and the sentence I'm trying to create. And everything else is blanked out. But that doesn't mean the rest of that stuff isn't still ongoing. So we're operating on multiple levels at a time, even though our awareness isn't necessarily a part of it.
Because I'm curious, because sometimes I like to take beings for a trip. Like I go and I hack them or something, energy, and experience stuff together, right? But then my sister told me one day, oh, I have a great experience, OBE, you took me somewhere, but I don't remember that experience. I remember others. So it's maybe like another part of myself did that, because the behavior of myself there was kind of like a thing I would do, but I don't recall.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that.
I've had the same thing with my wife, and we've even had lucid dreams on the same nights, but our information didn't match. But what you're saying is it very well could be
What
another
about the
part
metaphor part of it though? What is-
another part of us functioning. that we're-
Yeah, another part of you functioning. Now, there's two things that could be going on there. One is it could be just another part of you functioning, that the two awarenesses aren't connected so much, but it's really connected at some other level, if you like, not at your local level. The other thing that could be going on there, if somebody wants to help your sister out of body, and she knows that you do this, and she trusts you and likes you because you're her brother, then if some other entity were there to help her, guide, if you will, because it's her time, she can learn from this and it's good for her, then who would they come as? Certainly not as King Kong, right? That would scare her. So they come in as you, and they look like you, and they sound like you, and they talk like you, and she goes, oh, it's my brother, good, he'll help me. She feels better, she relaxes, you see. So it may or may not be you, it depends. The system is complicated enough that there's usually 2 or 3 different ways that things could happen.
Appearances are so deceptive there. How do you ever know when you're really dealing with
Appearances
the
are...
person you think you're dealing with?
Exactly. See, here, you know that, right? Because you know what your mother looks like, so you're not going to confuse her with somebody else. But there, it's just data. Okay, now if the only way you ever contacted your mother was by her voice over a speaker, right? Then you kind of get to know her voice. But what if that voice was always synthesized? Well, you wouldn't know. How do you know who it is? You don't. You see, you're like that. All you're getting is data. And that data doesn't come with a voice that you can recognize. It comes with a personality, it comes with a tone or whatever, but that can be mimicked. That's not that hard to mimic that. So you interpret the data. Now, if data seems like Claudio, then you would interpret the data as Claudio. So it's not that hard to look and feel like Claudio in a sense. You just need enough that you get the data interpreted that way. But we interpret everything. I mean, you don't have any other grip on reality when you're not here in this physical reality, other than you're getting data and you interpret it. So you interpret it as your grandmother because that's what that entity reminds you of.
Yeah.
And if an entity wants to help you and give you some information, they're going to be somebody that puts you at ease, somebody that doesn't cause fear. They're not going to be something with 3 heads and big fangs, because you're not going to wait around and wait for the message.
If I can ask further along this line, I've had many experiences interacting with apparent deceased individuals. Why, and many times I didn't initiate those experiences or even intend for them. So my question is, why would the system render such a thing to me, and from other people as well seem to have these experiences in a manner that's consistent with a free-willed, self-aware being that is continuing on in the dream world, the OBE world, or lucid dream realm, whatever.
Yeah. Why would you
do that?
Why would Grandma come and talk to you when you hadn't really intended to talk to Grandma?
Right.
So where's this come from?
When in fact, it would just be a database or another. Even it seems like a deception.
There's a couple of reasons why that happens. One, you are not always aware of your intents. For one, intents are kind of subtle things. So there actually may be some part of you at a level that's just below your intellect that is thinking about Grandma. So you're not quite sure there whether it's your intent or not. 2, an entity that wants to help you out or give you some sort of message or give you a nudge in the right direction is going to take the form of Grandma if Grandma is a very credible character to you. And just because that just makes sense. it's too hard to say, I'm the disembodied person, that, have come from, it doesn't compute for you. They want to relate to you in a way that you can get the information and deal with it. So if you had a lot of, extraneous stuff that had to do, well, who are you and what's your relationship and why you suddenly the message is now small and all this big stuff that you have to get through. It's easier just to get you a message in terms of something you're familiar with. So it's deception in a sense, but it's not deception for somebody else's benefit. Again, it's about you. It's something for your benefit, not something that somebody else is tricking you for their benefit. So yeah, sometimes you get deception. You get things that basically lead you to interpret things a given way. But usually you'll find out that it's helpful. It's almost always going to be helpful for you to interpret it that way. And the third thing is that it's your interpretation. Now, if something comes to you and gives you data, and there's something about that reminds you of grandma, you may say, oh, that's grandma, but it may not be grandma at all. Nobody may be trying to be like grandma. There's just something that you pick up there that reminds you, so your interpretation. So that's the other thing. So there's like 3 different ways that you can think about that. You have a hidden intent that you don't know. Somebody's trying to communicate to you and using grandma as a way to get the message across, or it's just somebody that's not trying to do anything particular, but you interpret them as grandma.
Pattern match it, because that's your closest.
That's your pattern.
Yeah, you
You
pattern
could
match
just
it.
talk of your relationship with your grandmother too, I mean, specifically, and if you would have, if your grandma would represent a loving being or not. Because someone, if my grandma came at me.
You run. Huh? Yeah. So it's any one of those 3 that you could approach it from and might answer your question.
A lot of times you said that sometimes the system will just, I think Jeff was trying to say, how do we know whether it's a real sentient being
It doesn't
interacting with
matter.
us or just a larger consciousness system giving us something?
It
And how
doesn't
do we know when
Yeah.
it's an authentic being, whether it's grandma or a being posing as grandma or just a consciousness system creating this illusion of something to try to help you? How do you know when it's an
Yeah.
actual authentic
Yeah.
being?
Linda was right on that one. She said it doesn't matter.
I'll tell you, I went to the Monroe Institute and I just lost my sister, and so I had a lot of experiences, and one was with my family, my sister, my mother, my father, who had all passed on. It was very profound to me. I came out of the experience, I was sobbing, it took me a long time to get over it, and I asked myself that very question, was it really them? It could have been my sister, she'd only been dead for 3 months, but my parents have been dead for years. But the end is, it didn't matter, because it was an experience for me to heal, and that's what it did. It was so healing to me. So it didn't matter how, the message came to me. The fact is, it came to help me, and it did. It's only your ego that wants you to, well, if it's not my sister, I don't want to talk to that person. That's just your ego talking. It's just really helpful to you.
Yeah. It's the same kind of question you get with like, you read a book, let's say you read the Carlos Castaneda books. Okay, and you read lately or afterwards as Castaneda passed away or whatever, that lots of people say, well, he faked it, he made it all up, It doesn't make any difference. You see, if you read a book that somebody faked and you learn something from it and it helps you grow, it makes no difference. Or you read a book that somebody didn't fake, boy, they got the word, directly out of the sky, and it doesn't help you. It doesn't mean anything to you. Who cares? You see? So it really doesn't matter. If the message you get is meaningful to you and you can learn from it, take it in and deal with it. If it isn't, it doesn't. The source is irrelevant. It doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. We get into belief. Well, I believe it if you're really my sister. But if you're not my sister, I don't believe it.
Because
Well,
you trust your sister, you trust your.
yeah, exactly.
But there's only one of us here.
You trust that.
It
Illusion
doesn't
of
matter
sister.
who the individual little,
Well, that's the way I think about healing too, is when I don't think I do that, but when you are healing someone, you're healing yourself.
Well, you're learning from it. It's part of a growing experience for you. It all interacts. Yeah.
Because we're all part.
John.
With a visitation like that, if the essence pulled out of the database of that person is represented in that, that is that person for all, there's no difference there.
Exactly.
If the essence of that person is a data in the database anyway, if that is represented to you, that is that person for all intents and purposes.
and anybody actually can access that database. You know, a database is an open database. So use what you can use and let go what you can't. And again, living gracefully with uncertainty, doesn't matter who it is, but the message heals.
Oh, that
You
was
know,
fantastic,
the experience is good.
That was
Well, then you
wonderful.
embrace the experience and you do it, and you live gracefully with uncertainty. It doesn't matter who, what, why, whatever. So that's another thing of not needing to know. You live gracefully with the uncertainty. Is that a real thing, or is that just my imagination? Well, it really doesn't matter. Is the message valuable to you? Can
That's
you
the
learn
wrong
from
question.
it?
Yeah, that's the wrong question. Did it help
Right.
you, or did you learn from it? That's the
Yeah,
question.
that's the right question.
Yeah.
But for beings that are fully in MPMR, they tend to communicate with other free will units more than, I mean, they would notice the difference, right?
Well, anything that communicates with us, we assume that it's a being. If it communicates, it's a sentient entity. If it communicates with us, it's our interpretation. Sort of our definition, right? Of sentient entity. So as we get data, we get a sentient entity. When we get a sentient entity, our habits of physical reality make us want to put a face, a name, a job. You know, we want to put all that to it. And generally that's unnecessary. So it's just information. And if you just treat it as information and not worry too much about the source and deal with it as information, then you don't worry all about the who, the where, the why, you know, how does it connect? It's just getting information from the larger consciousness system. It's all a part of the larger conscious system, whether it's, well, that's my guide and I can trust him. Well, the trust issue means that you're fearful that if it's not your guide, you're going to get bad information. Well, you need to let that fear go. You need to be able to take the information and see if it's valuable to you. If it's valuable to you and you can grow from it, doesn't matter where it comes from. So it's just information. It comes from the larger consciousness system, whether that means that's a part that you call the guide because you've made that little cubbyhole your guide cubbyhole, or whether it's a part that you call your sister, or whether it's a part that you call whatever else. It's just the larger conscious system. You're getting the data. What does it mean to you? And if you look at it and you say, that's nonsense, you know, that doesn't mean anything to me, or that's destructive, you know, that's not good, then you let it go. So you have to be able to sort on what you get and decide what to do with it, and that's your free will decision.
No, but I was asking, after we die and we are fully in NPMR,
Mhm.
and we tend to communicate with beings, I mean, we usually talk to other beings that have free will, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to keep communicating with databases all the time, right?
No, there's a difference. When you communicate with a database, the characters in the database do not have free will. Okay, that's out of the data. This is what Claudia's getting at, and he's right. And you can tell that. One of the ways that you can discover that, and it took me a long time to get that, because you know, you go back and you're looking at past lives and you do this kind of stuff, and I did that a whole lot, and eventually I kind of got an idea that it's a little different there. The tone, the feel there's a little flat. And then I realized that I could do the what-if analysis. Well, what if this wasn't like that, it was something else? And then we go off and do that. And then, you know, what if it was some other way? Then we go off and look at that movie, you see, and it's like, well, wait a minute, what's real here? You know, what's real? Because I could go off and do all these what-if analysis, and then I kind of got the idea that to test it. And I did some tests there to see whether or not, if you go back and trigger the same thing, do you get exactly the same result? You know, people with free will, if you ask them the same thing on different days, you're going to get different answers. Well, you go back and you trigger the same thing, trigger exactly, right up the same path, everything does exactly the same, and that was like a big aha moment for me. You know, this is me doing research on how does the thing work. And you get the same set, you know, each time you did it, and then it's like, oh, you know, there's no free will. This is the database. And you kind of learn that that's it, and then you notice that it's flat. You go in and sure, there's Uncle Harry, and you can talk, and it sounds and looks and acts exactly like Uncle Harry, but you notice that you never get anything unique. You never get anything novel. Yeah, you never get anything that kind of stands out as an unexpected. You just get Uncle Harry, and it's all Uncle Harry, and it exists exactly the way you remember it. And you may learn things new. Oh, yeah, you know, when I was 6 years old, this happened to me. That's a fact. And you go find out that that's true. You know, you get data you didn't know, but you don't get anything. Uncle Harry never stands on his head, you know, and does things like that that are unexpected. And you can do some research in that database, and then you realize that it's just a database, and it's very consistent. You query it the same way, you get the same answer, and you can find out things or stuff in there you don't know. But that's kind of when I had a big aha that this is not, you know, you get the idea that time, you know, everything exists at the same time, and like nothing ever stops, and you know, eventually logically that gets crazy. You know, it can't happen like that logically, and then that kind of solved all that problem. Oh, it's not that, you know, this is just a database. It's a talking database, you know, it's a all the probabilities are there. So I ask Uncle Harry about something and I get the probable answer that Uncle Harry would have given. And then given that answer, I get the next probable answer. So I can see a whole movie of what's going on based on the probabilities, and it's in that database. And then you can, the what ifs, you're slicing and dicing the probabilities different ways. You say, well, what if that really didn't happen? What if Uncle Harry never met Aunt Susie? You know, what would have happened then? And then you kind of see a different set of probabilities, and it's all there. And if you go back and ask that same question, you start at the same point, you run through the same things, you get to the same points, you can branch different ways, and then it's obvious that you're in a database. And talking to a database, it's not like talking to somebody with free will. Somebody with free will can make decisions and choices. They can stand on their head and wiggle their toes or do something like that. That's just right out of the blue. When you're in these data, whether it's the future, you know, the probable future, or whether it's in any historical, they actualized or non-actualized, you'll notice it's flat. There's hardly any surprises in there. Now there's informational surprises, but it's too flat to be, you know, real people aren't that flat. Real people do things that are odd. Yes.
What's the relationship between like your local awareness and kind of like your larger awareness? I guess, is it more like the larger awareness is kind of focused a little bit of his attention, you know, on this PMR, and that's kind of what it's doing as it can do other stuff, or is?
Yeah, it's like you have this larger awareness. It's you. It's your individuated unit of consciousness, and then you decide that you're going to join this virtual reality trainer. Okay, so then there's a part of that IUOC that now agrees to just get data according to the rule set inside that trainer and to interact with the other individuals in there. Okay, so that's within what I call the free will awareness unit. Now these are just arbitrary, you know, metaphors for this stuff. None of it really exists that way. But so then this is the part that's limited to the rule set interactions. It can't jump 20 feet in the air. It can't, you know, learn things but so fast. You know, it's a limited set. But they're all part of the same. They're all part of the same thing. Now, this free will awareness unit can, when it meditates, other things, it can kind of connect up with that bigger reality again. So mentally, it's not constrained. Its consciousness is not constrained. It's constrained physically. As it interacts in this physical world, it has to abide by the rule set. As consciousness, it's free.
So it's kind of the same awareness, and it's just artificially constrained.
Artificially constrained. So it's like a folder. So you take, like, this is the free will awareness folder. This is the local folder. Nothing can go in and out of that folder except stuff that passes through the rule set filter, if you will. It has to be in consonance with the rule fit. You know, the two things. It has to fit the rule set, and it has to not conflict with history. What's going on there? So you have consistency, and that's that. And that folder then is collecting data. So all the experience we're having here in this physical reality is going into that folder. Okay. Now that folder's in a bigger folder, which is your consciousness, your bigger consciousness. But that folder, that subfolder, if you will, is sitting there getting all this information through this filter and interacting. So you kind of think of it as a folder in a folder. Would probably be a good way to do it. Now when you're done, okay, and that body dies, well, you've got this folder sitting here. Now it's not like you collect it in that folder and then at the end it all gets uploaded to Daddy. It's just the larger folder, it's getting all the information all the time. It's a consistent thing. It's always going. But it's all in this folder, and that folder then represents the history, the experience that being had here. And that folder is unique. There's a unique part of that. Goes with that identity, you know, with that entity. So that's kind of the way that's sort of the way it looks. The relationship is it's the subset.
and your example before where, you know, you set up the trigger or whatnot and you were like
Mhm.
helping somebody else, you could have, if you wanted to, like, if you meditated and expand your consciousness, then you could have realized that you were helping.
Yes,
that
you
person
could.
Because,
What you would probably do, and it's happened to me plenty of times, is that if you're in a state where you're not focused in this reality, you're not digging a ditch, you're not composing a sentence, you're just kind of relaxed in this reality, suddenly, bam, it pops into your mind, you know, that so-and-so, you told them, call me if there's a problem, you know, and bingo, your thoughts go to them immediately, and then your next thought is, they're having a problem, you know, so it does come to you, and you do deal with it. But if you're not available, it happens anyway. So you can be aware of it if you're in a state where you're parallel processing. By parallel processing, I basically mean you're aware in more frames than one. So other times, you know, I can't be aware of anything more than this physical reality if I'm basically doing something that consumes all of my focus. Something you really have to be intently focused on to do. And often that'll be, you know, maybe if you're solving equations, or if you're writing difficult things, or whatever it is you're doing, or if you're doing some kind of physical hard labor. But anything you're doing that you kind of let your mind hang and you do it automatically, like driving a car, you know, where you can pay attention, but you're not really focused intently because you're on an interstate and it's just not that demanding. And it's not now, you're in really heavy traffic and everybody's going 80 miles an hour, you better be focused, you know, 100%. But if the traffic is light and everybody's going 65, and well, the mind kind of goes elsewhere. And then you can parallel process. Somebody swerves over and you have to change lanes, wham, that comes right back, you know, and now you're here. So sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't. It just depends on the demands that are set on you here. Yeah, that's the thing you can all try. You can all set that up if there's something you'd like to be doing, even when you're not aware of it. Set it up in your mind. That's the thing to do. And put the conditions on it. And you'll find that other people will report to you, you know, that they were aware of the things that you were doing, even though you weren't aware that you were doing them. It's a way to...
What do you mean by they're aware but not aware?
Well, they are aware. In other words, I have had people tell me that, oh, thank you, you know, you came to me, you know, when I called and this, and of course they asked me about it. They expected I remembered, you know, they expected I was perfectly aware of it. And I go, well, glad to do it, but you know, I was busy doing something else, you know, at the time. I have no awareness of it.
I'm sorry, when you say call, do you mean call on the phone or call?
No, call with the mind.
Gotcha.
So like
Right, that makes more sense.
yeah, so I set up a condition that says, if you need me, call. And I mean, say, Tom, I'm in trouble, come help me, you know, and they do that, then I will come help them, and I will get feedback that indeed I was there, indeed I did help them, but I have no memory of it because I was busy doing something else.
Okay, now I understand.
Yeah.
That way, I didn't hear that in the very beginning.
So can we call you too?
Yeah, I was about to say, we're going to sign up sheet outside for this.
But Tom, where is your focus?
Better
Like,
focus
you know, we have like
on
mind consciousness, like we're in the mind. Like, where is your focus on a regular basis? Like, you know, my consciousness is focused in PMR, it's constrained, and then when I meditate, I can slip into a different state, and I'm able to get out of like my mind kind of thing. Now, when you get to such a state where you're always out of your mind, and then you actually shift back. I mean, you actually shift back when needed to your mind. Where is your focus? In other words, you have like one little circle is PMR, and then you have a bigger circle. I mean, are you over here where we're mostly constrained here, and we slip out when we meditate properly? Whereas you're always over there, and you come back here when you need to.
It's some of all of the above would be the thing. It depends. There are times when I come back here as needed. There are times that I go out there as needed, and there are other times that I'm both places at once. When I sit and give a presentation, I stand up giving a presentation, and some of this while I'm here talking to you folks, I have to, somebody asks a question, I have to take the question, understand the question, not just understand the question, but understand what the asker really wants to know by the question, and then find an answer and put it into words that are rational. I have to do that in about 3 or 4 seconds, right? A lot of that I don't do intellectually. I'm partly here and partly not here. I'm partly here and partly also in a meditative state, if you will, such that I have access to information that otherwise I wouldn't have access to just with my intellect. So part of the answers that you get are answers that I'm getting at the same time that you're getting them, you know, and it's like that. And you live your life that way. It's not just in here, but you live your life that way to where all day, any day, no matter what you're doing, the information that you get is partly here that you're operating on your intellect, and partly it just comes from someplace else. Now, other people will say that it's intuition, right? They get this from intuition. But this is actually an active connection. It's not just that you get an intuition. Ted?
So when I answer questions, a lot of times on the board, and I don't consciously know the answer, but I give an answer, and you haven't told me that it was bad so far. I'm doing that, but I'm just clueless about it.
Yes.
You know that you're doing it.
Yeah, that's the difference if you're aware of it. But yes, you get those right answers, and it's interesting how you can kind of, you don't know, and you start typing, and then all of it comes together, and pretty soon, you know, you've given this really nice answer, and it happens to just suit, you know, and it just works out good. And it's because it's not just you doing it. You're in touch with a process that's working with you, through you. You're kind of in touch with a larger perspective. And sometimes before an answer, you can just kind of get into that state where you're just kind of open to the answer, and then just let it come out. You know, it's not like automatic writing, but you just kind of let it flow, and the ideas pop into your head, right? I wrote my books that way. You know, all the books that were written, I'd write down with my intellect about as far as my intellect would go, and then you just kind of let it go. And then all pieces would come into, you know, how to say this or how to do that, or, oh, look at that connection I didn't notice before. And then you go as far as your intellect would go. So it was, you know, it was that kind of a process that you have to do. Yeah, you do it all the time, I'm sure. You're just not aware that you're doing it. You know, I drive my contractors crazy. I'm doing a lot of construction in my house. We're putting a little addition on, and we have 20 years of damage, you know, that's been collecting. You know, I raised kids from birth to teenagers to now they're in their early 20s, you know, and all their friends, and you know, so we need a lot of work in the house to kind of put it back. And the contractor will come in and say, well, I'll tell him something. I say, well, you know, if you don't do this, such and such is going to be missed, and that's, you know, it's going to cause this problem over here. And he blows me off all the time. He says, oh, no. I says, that's not going to happen. And, you know, so I wait, you know, and it happens, you know. And he says, well, how'd you know that? You know, I don't know, it's obvious. Yeah, you could tell these things that happen, you know. And I would tell him things over and over again. And, you know, I'm not supposed to know anything. And he's the contractor that knows how all these things work. But Bob, as a matter of fact, this particular contractor, it's really interesting. He had a daughter born the same day in the same hospital that my daughter had her first baby, and a baby boy. And they were both in the hospital at the same time, at the same place. And I remembered this guy. And when I was in there at this with my new grandson, and they're visiting my daughter, this guy was also there with his nose against the glass wall, just like I was, you know. And I got this voice, this knowing. And he said, you're going to work with that guy. He says, you're going to work with him, and you ought to go over and introduce yourself and tell him that you're going to work with him. And I said, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. Now, here's this great big guy. He's got a real scruffy face. His head kind of looks like a big cantaloupe. He's 400 pounds. He's wearing bib overalls, and he speaks deep South Alabama, you know. And I thought, well, I'm going to be real interested to see how that works out. You know, how I'm going to work with this guy. But I did not go over and introduce myself and say, no, the guy will freak out. You know, that's not something you do. That's just not appropriate. But sure enough, he turned out to be the contractor. And that was like 3 years later. You know, he turned out to be the contractor. And I'd kind of forgotten about it, and then it turns out that his daughter and mine, and it was the same place, and then I go, oh yeah, I remember you. And I said, well, you were heavier then. Now he was only about probably about 300, maybe 250, something like that. He's still big, but he was huge before. So and I said, well, you weighed a lot less then. He didn't remember me at all, you know. And he said, yeah. He says, I used to weigh about 400 pounds, and you know, I lost 150 pounds or something. So I didn't recognize him. But, so you get this all the time because it's like, you know, when you're in a meditation state, you're kind of connected, you say, well, you stay connected. It's not that you lose that connection and come back here. You keep that connection and you're back here too.
So you're hardwired then? We have like a wireless that kind of gets like fuzzy, you're just hardwired.
Yeah, you just basically do it all the time. And you use it in your work, you use it in your life, you use it to solve problems. You know, and I would working at NASA, I would get a problem, and it's usually the big complex problems. And it's like, where do you start? You know, you get this problem, and what do you do first? And if you try to solve that problem just with your intellect, it'll drive you nuts because there's like 50 different ways to approach it, and each way that you approach it has all different kinds of outcomes. So you just kind of let it go, and then you start somewhere. You just start somewhere, and then you build from that, and this and that. And pretty soon, damn, you've got this solution. And the amazing thing is, it turns out it's the optimum solution. That there were 20 ways to approach the problem, and this way was by far, you know, the optimum solution. And there it is. Well, how did you just come up with an optimum solution out of 20 or 30 different approaches? You know, instead of before, when I used my intellect, you'd get halfway there and you go, oh, this isn't going to work, you know. And after your 4th or 5th attempt, you might find the optimum solution by trial and error. But it's much easier to come up with the optimum solution the first try if you're plugged into the larger reality than it is if you're just trying to think of it with your intellect. Because your intellect's limited to what you know. The larger reality doesn't have that limitation. And if you just pay attention to it, it really works out pretty well.
So that egoic mind chatter that we sometimes have to deal with and fight with, that doesn't exist for you anymore?
Not much, you know, that you fight with, no. I don't know that it ever existed a whole lot.
So you came in hardwired?
I came in probably hardwired, yeah.
When you
probably.
go to the problem solution, is what you do go step by step backwards from the problem to what happened before that, to what happened before that, to what happened to figure out how to do that?
No, I just start anywhere. You know, it's like I've learned, don't try to control it. I get an idea and I say, well, this is a part of it. I'm going to have to do this part, so we'll just start there. So we start there and we start working on it, and it just, well, I should do this next. And I should, you know, there's 6 ways to do it, but I should do it that way. That just kind of feels right. It makes sense. And you're getting all this stuff. And then by the time you're done, you have this optimal solution that it should have taken you 6 months to figure out that you've just done in 2 weeks.
Because you just let go.
Because you just don't try to control it. You don't try to use the intellect.
When you say problem, then you mean like a task?
Yeah, like a task.
Okay, but not something that has gone wrong and you're trying to figure out how not to go wrong?
No, this is a task. Like, here's one that was fun that I did for NASA. And see, I do risk analysis. And typically I do risk analysis of things that aren't obvious how to do them, because otherwise they'd do them themselves. They wouldn't call on a consultant. So this particular one, they wanted to know, and the reason I say this one is it's kind of fun, they wanted to know what was the probability that if you launch, in that case it was the Ares rocket, that it would run into a bird. What was the probability to run into a bird? Because if it runs into a bird, it's a real serious problem. Not that the bird is flying so fast, but the rocket's flying so fast. So the bird you're going to assume is stationary. Doesn't matter. The little bit of kinetic energy they bring to the problem is trivial. But what happens is you got a rocket going, you know, 800 feet per second, you know, just around the sound barrier, and if it runs into a 5-pound bird, you're talking about, you know, megajoules of energy. You're talking about something that'll just rip that rocket apart. At the least, it'll strip all the insulation off of it, which means you'll get heating, which will tear the thing apart. So basically it's a destruction. And they wanted to know, out of that first however many feet where birds are, you know, get too high and there aren't any birds, what was the probability of hitting one? And if so, then what would be the damage? How could you expect the damage? And what could you do about it? And so on. So that was just a problem I had. It was a risk problem. So, you know, how do you start with that? You know, what do you do with it? This is why they call me, because they don't know what to do with that. You know, how do you deal with it? So I just started working on it, you know, and I ended up about a year later with this humongous, you know, model that modeled birds and rockets and all the pieces and things that hang out. You know, what if it hits an engine? You know, what if it hits the fuselage here? You know, what if it does this and that? What do you do with the kinds of birds, types of birds? How high do they fly? What's the probability of them being there during the season, during the winter, during migration? And you know, where are you in the migration lanes? And Goes on and on and on. You got all this information that you have to do. So that was the kind of problem.
When they saw that assessment.
Yeah, they did actually. It was a real interesting assessment. It turned out the probability of the risk was a lot higher than they had imagined. It was quite a bit higher because of where they are. You know, when you're next to the Everglades, you know, on a coast where wetlands are, you know, I mean, you have a lot of birds around.
Barrier islands.
Yeah.
The whole barrier islands.
Yeah. So you get a lot of, so it was a much bigger problem really than they thought, but it was a fun problem. I enjoyed that. You know, but it was nice analysis to do. But those are the kind of problems. But see, there's all kinds of ways to approach that. You know, how are you going to model a bird, right? And you have to make a mathematical model of a bird carcass and how that bird interacts. It's very important. How does that bird smush? You know, it sounds funny, but how that bird smushes is really important.
They use frozen chickens at first.
Yeah, what they
And
do
then
when
they
they,
model
yeah,
the
at,
bird.
what's the name of the place in Tennessee? They have a place there where they test jet canopies, you know, the plastic canopies that are over the top jets. And Arnold, I think it's Arnold Laboratories, it's in Tennessee. And they have a frozen chicken cannon. Basically, it's a tube, and they'll put a compressed air behind it, and they'll put this chicken in some sort of with a thing behind it that collects the air, and there's enough pressure, and there's a long barrel that they accelerate this chicken to 500, 600 feet per second. It's a very fast chicken. And then that chicken, well, they thaw it out first, but they start with frozen chickens, and then it'll hit the canopy, and then they look at damage. You know, could the canopy, and that's an aircraft going just subsonic run into a bird, because they do. Aircraft fly a lot at lower levels, particularly if they're doing tactical flights. They fly as close to the ground as they can get because radars can't see them down there. So they're buzzing along just subsonic at 200 feet, and you get hit with a 4 or 5 pound bird, and it basically destroyed the plane. So they need to have something that'll bounce that bird off without destroying the plane. Tremendous forces get involved. A bird at those kinds of speeds produce like maybe 500,000 pounds of force. Monstrous forces. So yes, there is. There's a chicken gun that fires chickens at canopies. There's all kinds of strange things in this world. So where are we?
Can you talk a little about male and female dynamics? Something you talked about you might write a book about. Could you give us a few thoughts about?
Yeah.
You start that book yet?
No, I haven't made any progress on it whatsoever. I've been too busy. What I was thinking about for that particular book was that if you strip away all of the cultural overlays that we have, how we define ourselves as male and female, take away all the cultural stuff, what do you have left? So what is the primal male, the primal female, and how they relate without the culture? Well, it's a little hard to do because there isn't anybody living without a culture. Everybody's living inside a culture. But it helps if you kind of have the big picture, because if you kind of get outside of this reality frame, then you kind of get outside of our cultures as well. And that was going to be what the book was about. So it was going to be kind of the fundamental male-female in a relationship, and how does that work sans culture? So what's the basic dynamic at the root? What's the basic dynamics of the relationship? And I got a little bit of it. I kind of got an outline and some parts of it done, but then I got too busy, so I haven't done anything with it at all for months and months. But someday I'll get back to.
Can you give us a few nuggets?
No. You had a question.
I wanted to ask you about something else, kind of a big picture question. Because I was doing some math, and it occurred to me that the average person here has probably spent maybe the equivalent of thousands or tens of thousands of years in NPMR. And I know you've talked a little about it, and I'm not interested in stories, but more from a functional point of view, in terms of the evolutionary process. What is the average, what can I say, individuated unit of consciousness doing all that time in NPMR? I know you said that there isn't as much traction there as there is here. So, but what role does it play in the big picture?
Okay, there are, for one, a lot of entities don't spend that much time. They don't spend a lot of time in the non-physical. It's not until later that they start spending more time there. In the beginning, they pretty much need to learn, need to grow up. And in the process of doing that, this kind of a reality is much better. So they will pop into this reality, and as soon as they die here, they'll be right back again. No planning, no thought to it, just dive in, go out, dive in, and so on. And it's just to gain experience. So there's very little time spent, not even the processing time, because there's really nothing to process. They don't have enough data yet to process. Eventually, you get enough data to process that when you die here and you go out, you spend some time planning the next one, looking at your weaknesses, looking at your strengths, what went wrong, what did you do, and it's like you watch the movie of your life, at least the significant parts where being level was involved, and you see, oh boy, I did that really bad. I've got this anger management problem. I need to fix that. So then you think, well, let me get in a situation where that anger management is, where anger is challenged, because that's what I need to challenge that. Something, if I do it wrong, I'll get slapped hard. And you pick a situation like that, and you may even eventually pick other entities to share that with, to be part of that. And you do some planning. At first, no planning. Now you do more planning. Now you also, not only does the larger consciousness system bubble up entities like us that are here trying to lower entropy, but also it bubbles up entities like your guides. That's just another entity bubble up out of the system as needed. You're bubbled up out of the system as needed, and so are they. And for them, that's what they do, and they're learning. And sometimes there's cross between. Sometimes after some time here, you work as a guide for a while, and sometimes guides will end up being here. So there's other things you can do, but mostly we don't hang out in a non-physical for long periods of time. Mostly we're engaged in a trainer, or we have some other sort of job like guide or some other kind of thing, or we're not manifest at all. We're just part of the larger system. We're just a part of the bigger system. We're not actually doing much at all. So it's not like we're just out there hanging out in the non-physical, wasting time or waiting for something else to happen. It's generally not like that, because you don't get much traction out there. Again, like we said, it's just data. What if we were all, instead of interacting like this, what if we were all in separate rooms in this hotel and all we had was a mic and a headset? That's all we could hear, and all the voices were synthesized. So no matter who said it, it all comes out sounding like the same computer talking, right? There's no variations in voices. Well, that's kind of what it's like. How much are you going to learn and grow there? You have no traction at all on what's happening. You have very little feedback. You don't, you just, it's hard to interact at that level.
So it sounds like it's mainly, its purpose is mainly to sort of debrief us after we leave here.
Yeah.
And prepare us for the next experience package.
Yes.
It's not a place where we spend long periods of time hanging out or attending classes or anything like that.
No. And even the attending classes things tends to be short. And a lot of the attending classes, a lot of people, if you get the, what was the guy named Michael Newton, whatever, he'll tell you about, they attended classes, they did this, they did that. A lot of that is just fluff. A lot of that is just make work. Keep you busy, keep you focused on something so that you can, as you acclimate. What happens as soon as you die here is that you become aware in the larger reality, but you're disoriented. Most people are, because they don't have any concept of what's going on, And in order to keep that person from then becoming hysterical and whatever, usually there's something comforting going on. They're met, they're guided, your family will be here, all this kind of stuff. And then while they kind of decompress and let all that go, because then this reality frame starts to leave them like a dream leaves you when you wake up. It just starts to fade away. Well, while that process is going on, because some of them come with some pretty tight connections, that don't fade away easily. While that process of just kind of letting it go, they have busy work, things to do. oh, go stand in this line and wait for that, and then do this, and, you know, here, we get you put it in this course, and a lot of it's standing around waiting. Well, all that is made up so that time goes by, and they have something to focus on happening next, because they're used to that in this physical reality that, you know, things progress and things happen, and you have to do something to get somewhere. They're kind of in a physical reality, but not quite, and they're making the transition. So many of the classes that you hear about are really not teaching them anything particular, other than it's taking up their time until they can kind of let go, and eventually they get to a point where they are to review what it is they have. You know, if they're far enough along, they're going to review what they've been doing, where their weaknesses are mainly. It's not so much the strengths that anybody cares about. It's what are the weaknesses. What were you really needed? You know, where do you need to learn? And then try to pick something out that gives you that situation, that challenges you in those areas where you need most to be challenged, which is why so many of us struggle all the time, because nobody's giving us easy stuff. They're not giving you, not giving you the stuff you've already learned. They're giving you the stuff that you need to learn. So we tend to struggle and struggle and struggle because we're put into situations that are hard. They're difficult for us. They're challenging us to grow up. So that happens, and then back in. Okay, and that's mainly what's going on. So you kind of met, you know, the greeter, right? It's like the Walmart greeter. You know, first there's somebody there, and oh, come this way, everything's fine, it'll be okay. You know, everything's okay. Just come over here. There's somebody you need to meet, which kind of buys a little time because it's all kind of sliding away from them, and then your friends will be here in just a moment. See, nothing ever happens right away. You always have to wait for something to happen, and that's because they're trying to stretch this out and give the time for it to dissipate. Eventually, after they've been standing in line and waiting and having all these little experiences, it's gone. It's like a dream. You know, their life now, what they did. Yes, even their children and their dog and all the things all this kind of fades and goes away. And by that time, then you still need to let them kind of get bored, to where they start asking about, well, you know, where am I supposed to, you know, what's supposed to happen next? And then when they get bored is when you start to move them into the reprocessing of, well, let's look and see what happened. You know, wouldn't you like to do this again? Now they can say no, and if it's no, they can go back and, you know, stay bored. But usually it turns into a yes pretty quick. So it's that sort of thing, and then it recycles. And it happens again. But there's a whole group that just does that kind of work, that in processing, if you will. And you know, you can work there if you get to where you can meditate and get into that space. Ask for a job, and you'll get a job working there, to where you are the greeter that comes in and says, "Oh, it'll be all right. Just wait here a minute." You know, your friends will be along in a little bit, and then just about the time they're starting to get agitated for waiting, friends show up. You know, you drag it out about as long as you can, and then they have the interaction with Aunt Susie and Uncle Fred and all that kind of. Of course, that's right out of the database, and but they have that interaction, and then that doesn't last too long, and Uncle Fred has to leave, and everybody has to go. You wonder why they have to leave. Why are they so busy? You know, why wouldn't they just hang out? But, well, they have to go away, and then come on over here, and we'll do something else. And it's a process designed to make people feel at ease and relaxed until they can change, you know, their mental track of what they're on. And then you get into a blank spot where there is no track. They don't know what's going on, and they're not quite sure what should happen. They're just waiting, and then they're bored and ready to go on and experience something else. Then you move them into the next phase. So that's basically what happens. Now, if you don't need all that processing, you don't have to do all that processing. If you don't need all that processing, you can go right to the end of the line and start over, make your plans and go. But a lot of people have no clue, and being clueless, they're easily frightened. And you can't just throw them into things that they can't process, because then you just create trouble. So that's generally what happens. So no, people don't spend a lot of time in a non-physical. And the newer you are at the game, the less time you spend there. But you can wait in between times if you like, but there's just not that much going on. And remember, here you are in this motel with nothing but a mic and a headset. You know, unless somebody wants to give you an image or something that you relate to and you can interpret oh, there's a nice man in a white robe, you know, and if you're religious, you can put wings on his back if you want, you know, and that's, you can get into that. But there's not a lot going on there.
So where most of the growth or evolution takes place in the larger system is in the PMRs.
It's
That's
here.
where the action is.
That's where the action is. Yes, that's where the action is. Now, there are those entities that don't get involved in PMRs. There are entities that never come here. They just hang out in NPMR. They have their own societies, clans, interactions, groups, and they just stay there. They've never been into a PMR. They're not interested. And there are such entities around, but they don't evolve much. You see, this is the fast track. This is where you come if you really, you know, want to get someplace. This is where the action is, exactly. And most of the negatives that opt out of this tend to be negative. They're not in the climbing up the positive evolution. Thank you, no thanks. You know, I don't need any of that.
So that's why they kick you down, so they try to see if they can kick you around and screw with you a little bit?
Sometimes. So there are entities that just stay there, but they don't do a whole lot, and they mainly stay grouped up in, you know, what you'd think of small social units. But and they, as you see them, you interpret something, but whether what you interpret is really what's there, you know, it's hard to say.
But there are opportunities, if you will, to volunteer there, to be on sort of the processing staff. Because I've seen from my own experience, for some reason I was really drawn to what seemed to me to be an area where they work with people who had very traumatic lives, children who've been abused, or soldiers who've suffered terribly in a war. And these beings seem to have a much harder time transitioning.
Exactly.
There seems to be like a special staff,
There
almost
is.
like a psychiatric hospital, although that's a poor analogy, where there are beings over there in NPR who work with these traumatized consciousnesses and help them to move on. That's what I saw.
Yeah, that's there. What I was telling you was like the normal processing, where the great majority end up. That's the normal processing. But there's also a group, a unit, a section of this that focuses on the difficult processes, and they are of all different types and reasons of why they're difficult, and they need special help. You just can't say, oh, Uncle Fred's coming to greet you, and it's all right. Come on in, walk toward the light down there, and wait in line. I'll be down there in a minute. You can't do that with them because they're hysterical. They're damaged. And that they have to be handled very differently. And that and you can volunteer for that. Actually, you can volunteer for the other two. You can work in either one of those areas, and you can do it just while you're in a meditation state. You can get in that meditation state or that out-of-body state, and you'll be given an assignment, and you'll be given a situation, and your job is to help calm them down, bring them back to a place where they can function again, and you'll be given some encouragement. But particularly, it's good if these beings are coming from our reality, say from a PMR like ours, you are more effective than somebody who's never been here because you understand it. You've seen the trauma here. You can imagine what they've been through. You've got some sense of it. And somebody that's never been here doesn't. All they see is somebody that's terribly damaged, and they don't really understand how anybody could get that way.
So it's not just processing for beings coming out of this PMR, it's processing for...
They process for beings coming out of other PMRs too. You can get involved in any of those if you want to. It's just like you don't work in your neighborhood, factory. You work in a factory over in the next county.
Do you always know if you're doing something like that? Do you always know if you're doing something like that?
Generally.
And the reason I'm asking is the morning after the tsunami, Arthur had a rough night. His clothes were sweat drenched. It's the only time it's ever happened that I can think of. And I was just wondering, I just thought he was very...
He may have been connected with that. But yes, and if you do that, what you'll notice is that you're out there, you're available, your intent is good, is to be helpful. Somebody comes by, basically gives you a job. Here's these children, and this such and such has happened to you. You're given a job, and you're set in a situation, and it's up to you to figure out what to do to help them. and you try different things, and some of it works, and some of them you try something else, and it's basically your job to do that. And you get picked because, one, you're available, two, you have intent that says, yes, I'm willing to help, and three, you have an understanding of their situation enough that you'll be cleverer at being able to help them. So you get recruited in that sense. And if you make it, any of you, if you make it known that you would like to help in that sort of thing, you probably will be. You will probably be picked and, given somebody to work with. So it's not a difficult thing to do, to get employment there. You can
What
do
happens if the
that.
phone rings though while you're doing that, or something to get your attention here?
If that happens, well, then that happens. Your attention kind of blips out, but typically you have such a connection to it, because once you get, you kind of get in that mindset, you're given a job, that you will right away go back to it. Particularly if you know that you're not just hallucinating, you're actually, this is important. You will go back to it as soon as you can. But if that happens and you don't, for whatever reason, say your own house catches on fire, right? Then you have to do other things. Then you find somebody else. Somebody else will have to work that.
Not necessarily meditating?
You can do it when you're asleep. It's just that if you're asleep, you won't know it. Unless it's a lucid dream. But you can do that in a sleep. You just won't be aware of it. This is a lot of things we do, like we were saying here before, that you're not necessarily aware of. This way, you're aware of it. And there's generally always somebody that needs some kind of special help. And some of them are very challenging. I've worked in that area too. Some of them are very challenging as to what you can do to help them out. But yeah, it's available to anyone. Yeah, Ted?
I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding something. There's only such a small, the difference between the cycle rate, the state cycles from the consciousness system to PMR or NPMR. There's a vast number of consciousness system states.
Mm-hmm.
For every state change here.
Mm-hmm.
And our IUOC code doesn't just sit idle if it's not processing a cycle here and the next cycle. All that time in between, it's functioning as part of AUM.
Yes,
Sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
When you go between these different time, you don't really notice the time change. It's just like think of yourself as a character in a movie, right? If you're the character, every frame, something moves. The next frame, something moves. The next frame, something moves. Now, whether those frames are going by at 30 frames per second or 300 frames per second, you don't notice. You don't say, oh, gee, I'm really going fast, because there's no sense of fast if you're the character in it. So when you're in the non-physical, time seems like time, and when you're in here, time seems sort of like saying time. You measure time by kind of the events that happen. Now, you may be there at what seems like a long time and come back here and it's only been minutes. You've probably had all those things. We had all these elaborate dreams and all kinds of things happen. You realize you're only going to sleep for 3 minutes,
Yeah.
And vice versa. You can flip the other way as well. So you can have a different sense of time, but you don't really say, wow, this is fast time now. Everybody's moving really quick, because you're in it and it's just one increment at a time, whether it's fast or slow. So you don't have a big time sense between the two, but you operate in both. And as you operate in both, if your awareness is in the non-physical, yes, that time step's going fast, but you don't really see it as fast. Your judge of time is by how much the events go by. And time in this, time in that, aren't really, you never get a conflict in them. At least I've never gotten a conflict in them.
In all of the other system states, you're not conscious of at all. You're just functioning as whatever you function. You may have the X digit of pi, that it's your function to stick in at the right point, as just a way of smart-ass saying it. But, we don't know what the hell we do in the big system, and we're not aware of any of that at all. We're just part of at the time.
Yeah, we are part of the larger system. I think, my metaphor I try to get rid of all the little cubby holes that we put ourselves in, and I just think of it as we're all one. We're all in this big system, and as we become useful to the system, it bubbles us up and we do our thing. And that we actually aren't this individuated unit of consciousness that's separate from the big system. That's just a metaphor, so we can talk about these things in a way that we can process them. We're always just a piece of the larger system. We're just a subset of that larger system all the time. Yet we will limit a subset of ourselves, of our awareness, to the physical reality. And we start talking about it like they're places that we go and visit and stay, and that, you know, and that here's non-physical, and that's a place, and here's the section where you matriculate in from a death, and we start to talk like that, but that's because that's the only thing we can, that's the only way we can frame it up and build concepts that we can talk about. We have to talk about it in terms of our physical experience. So we turn it into physical things, but I don't think we're really all separate anyway. It's all just, we're just one thing. We're little subsets of a big thing. And we are really that whole thing, even if little pieces of it are in this rule set, while pieces of that, we're still really a chunk of the whole thing. That's our home base. These other things that we're doing, well, we build up these metaphors to describe them, basically, because there's a function that we need to describe. And most of, you know, when we talk about my model, and I talk about higher selves, and I talk about guides, and we do all this, don't take those too literally. If you take them too literally, all you're doing is painting a PMR picture on top of the non-physical. That's just so we can communicate, and so that we can build up a logical structure and talk about it. Because we have these different functions and aspects of ourselves. There is the part of ourselves that comes here and is restricted to this reality frame, because this is where the action is as far as evolution goes. So here we are. You know, we're the working fluid in the evolution system, and we're going around and around through the cycles, evolving.
Do you think any of us will need help, Justin?
Oh no, I suspect that most people here will probably take the shortcut, because they're all really aware of what's going on. They don't need all that. You guys aren't going to need all that hand-holding and treatment so that you don't, you know, freak out and get upset and whatever. It's like, you know, you just go straight to the, you know,
To the mothership.
right to the mothership, right? You don't need all that processing, because most of that is just a comfort. It's a comfort thing, because you cannot teach, you cannot learn, you cannot decide what to do next and what's important if you're freaked out. If it's, you know, so it's all comforting.
What happens when time warps for you? Like you're in an emergency and time suddenly slows down. Are you just more conscious of the delta T's when normally you're not conscious? What happens, or something seems to speed up when you can't process it fast enough? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, that's your awareness. When you focus very intently, when your mind is kind of, what can I say, very focused on a thing, time goes by slowly. It seems like that your delta T's, you know, suddenly got longer. You got a whole lot more time to consider between delta T's. Yeah, a lot more over that little bit of time.
Right.
Right, it seems that way, but that's because you got all your attention focused on one thing. But now when you're in that bigger focus, to where you kind of spread out over the whole, that's when you meditate for 15 minutes, and you find out actually 45 minutes have gone by.
Yeah.
You know, you get done with it and say, well, that was a little short meditation, but I think I'll get up now. Yeah, and an hour's gone by or something else. That's kind of the opposite thing of that. So it has to do with your focus, how tightly you're focused on things. But yet your sense of it can speed up and slow down, because your focus gets to be very, very small.